Welcome, weary listener. As the world outside winds down and the quiet hush of night settles in, allow your mind to drift not forward, but back beyond the pages of myth, past the marble columns of Athens, and into the dust and stone of a different kind of Greek city. This is not a tale of shields and spears, not entirely. It is the slow, unhurried unfolding of a society where silence was strength, where comfort was suspect, and where even sleep might have been seen as indulgence. Tonight, we journey not through the glory of Sparta, as sung by poets or painted in stories of heroism, but through the cold, dry corridors of everyday Spartan life. Imagine for a moment that you're standing on the cracked earth of Laconia. The air is still, the olive trees sway only slightly, and beyond them rise low mountains, their outlines hazy in the heat. There's no laughter in the streets, no vendors crying out, no debate echoing from public squares. Here, the rhythm of life is slower, yet heavier, and as the starvation as policy. Imagine, if you can, being a boy of 7, small, but no longer treated as such. Your mother's arms no longer yours to sleep in. Her voice is quiet now deliberately, so because saying goodbye too loudly is discouraged. You're taken from your home in the cool hours of morning. No toys, no blanket, no softness follows. Just your body, your name, and the silent understanding that you are now a property of the state. But to mold, to harden, and, in some cases, to destroy. This is the Agoge Sparta's infamous training system, designed not to educate in the way we think of school. It began with removal separation from everything tender, and then came the stripping down. The Agoge was not optional. All Spartan boys, no matter how beloved by their families, entered this long corridor of discipline. 1 tunic per year was all you received, regardless of weather, and meals, meals, clothes, were sparse. Shoes were discouraged. Baths were infrequent, not for fun, and not for sport, but as a slow rehearsal for war. They were not meant to satisfy. Warmth came from the body and the will. He could beat them. He often did. And it was not considered cruel. It was considered necessary. The line between education and domination blurred until no one remembered it had ever existed. A thin porridge, a wedge of dark bread, and the expectation that hunger would sharpen the senses. In Sparta, such mentorships were considered a part of education. Not all were fizzy, but many blurred boundaries. It was a different time, a different system, but always power flowed in one direction, praised, even admired, for being ruthless, for being strong, for staying quiet when their ribs were broken. It was not just neglect, it was strategy. If you wanted more food, you had to steal it, and if you were caught, you weren't punished for the theft. They would leave with furrowed brows or shaking heads. But the Spartans, ever proud, would explain, "We make men here." A boy in the Agoge was not fed until full. He was fed until barely functional. You were punished for being caught. The message was simple, yet chilling. You must be cunning. You must be invisible. You must survive without pity. They weren't necessarily expected. They faded away, quietly, from a system that had no room for softness, and so they did, or tried. Some boys, those deemed too weak or too slow, simply didn't last. Bruised, hungry, exhausted, still children, yet already belonging to something far colder than family. The days were long and measured. Physical training dominated the daylight hours. Wrestling, running, striking, enduring. Spartans prized obedience. Instruction in reading and writing was minimal. Just enough to understand orders. Just enough to obey. Literature, philosophy, curiosities, these belonged to other Greeks. At night, the boys slept in dormitories. No pillows, no mattresses, just woven reeds cut from the riverbank, and often no fire in winter. The boys organized themselves in packs, with one boy slightly older the iron appointed as a kind of drill sergeant. But even here, among the bruisers and barked orders, there was a hierarchy. Some boys excelled. They were made leaders. Occasionally, visitors from other cities would watch these boys in training. There was something else, too, something unspoken. The boys were watched closely by adults, particularly by older men, who sometimes entered into relationships with them. As the years passed, boys who survived the Agoge emerged into a different kind of struggle adulthood in a society that never stopped testing. But we'll get there in time. For now, as the training fields fall into dusk, and the bruised silhouettes of boys retreat to their cold dormitories, we leave them in silence. And in this silence, let us move gently forward toward the most famous moment in Spartan lore. Sweat, death, and spin. The sun has risen again over the stony hills of northern Greece, but instead of peaceful fields or shaded olive groves, we find ourselves in a narrow mountain pass. Rocky cliffs rise sharply to one side, and the sea presses in on the other. Facing them, a small force led by King Leonidas of Sparta and his now mythic 300. It is hot, the air thick with dust and tension, and all around you, the clink of armor and the murmur of waiting men fill the silence. This is Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a name drawn from the nearby sulphurous springs, though today it feels more like the edge of the underworld. They were expected to die. That was the plan. It is for 80 BCE, and a Persian army, said to number in the hundreds of thousands, presses ever forward into Greece. But the story we tell now is not the legend. It is the slower, quieter, and far more uncomfortable reality. This was not about last stands or fiery speeches, not because they were weak, but because the Spartans were a human wall. This was about delay. First, understand this. The 300 Spartans were not alone. They were joined by several thousand other Greek thespians, and others, though it is Leonidas's men who would become icons. Only his 300 remained, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who refused to flee, mostly because their deaths were memorable and politically useful. Spears broke, forming a last redoubt, a small hill of resistance beneath the Persian tide. Men slipped on the boulders of comrades. Some fought with daggers, others with teeth and bare hands. Each Spartan was a fully trained soldier of the elite homoid, or equals, chosen not just for skill, but for having sons to carry on their bloodline. The myth helped unite Greece, but it also helped gloss over the brutal machinery that produced such soldiers. But plans in Sparta were rarely emotional, not because they were inspired by liberty or legend, but because they had trained endlessly for this precise form of warfare. The story of 300 brave men standing alone against the East, an ideal of what Spartan discipline and sacrifice could achieve. Phalanx fighting was not elegant. It was grinding, shoving, claustrophobic work, a push of flesh and bronze, sweat slicking the grip of spears, screams muted by helmeted faces, both tragic and calculated. The Spartan strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Stall the Persians long enough for the other Greek city-states to prepare a defense, likely not expecting eternal fame, but simply obeying orders, as they had been taught since they could walk. And so, the narrow terrain of Thermopylae was chosen not for symbolic reasons, but for its tactical limitation. A wide army could not advance easily through the pass. For 2 days, the Spartans held, shields locked, spears thrust forward in tight, disciplined lines. The Persians attacked in waves. Infantry, archers, even the elite immortals, all were turned back. But then came betrayal. A local Greek, hoping for a reward, revealed a hidden path over the mountains. The Persians took it. The Spartans were now flanked. Surrounded, Leonidas had a choice and made it swiftly. He sent most of the Greek allies away. They fought to the last, but not all at once. Death did not come as a single glorious charge. It came slowly. Shield arms grew numb. In the end, their bodies were found piled together, but what was left behind was more than corpses. The nightmare beneath the glory. As we descend from the battlefields and mountain passes, we come to the quiet, cultivated fields of Laconia. Wheat rustles in the wind. Olive trees dot the horizon. Goats graze lazily along stone terraces, and the landscape seems almost idyllic. But here, just beneath the soil, lies the secret on which the Spartan Empire stood. They were the enslaved majority, the ones who plowed the fields, harvested the crops, tended the animals, and made sure the elite warrior caste never had to lift a hoe or a hammer. Instead, they were hereditary serfs, bound to the land, their status inherited and enforced by terror. This bizarre ritual, known as the cryptia, allowed Spartans to legally murder helots without religious penalty. Young Spartan men, barely more than teenagers, were sent out at night with knives. Their task, to terrorize the helot population, to kill silently, to enforce obedience through fear. You live in a small hut, working sunrise to sunset, and every year, the young warriors of Sparta are allowed and encouraged to hunt you in the dark. Your children must grow up watching you bow your head in silence when Spartans pass by. Your life is not your own. It is an open prison, shaped by fear and tradition. Making the tools, cleaning the mess, a helot could not be freed. They lived with their families in small villages, technically allowed to marry and own a few possessions. The nameless, faceless majority who suffered to keep the myth alive. But all under the thumb of state violence. The phalanx, the discipline, the perfect warriors. All of it floats atop a system of grinding exploitation. But by the time Sparta's power peaked, Helot simply meant those who were owned. For every Spartan citizen, there were at least 7 Helots, maybe more. And yet, you will not find Helot names in Spartan poems. Let their silence linger. Let the truth unsettle the legend. They built the food supply, but not the glory. Over time, they tried to rebel, sometimes violently, but with no weapons, no rights, and no allies. Most uprisings were crushed brutally. Their labor kept Sparta running, and their misery was necessary to sustain the illusion of Spartan greatness. The word Helot comes from the name of a conquered people, possibly from the city of Helos. These were not slaves in the typical ancient sense. They weren't bought and sold in markets. Each year, the Spartan government declared a formal war, not on another city, but on the Helots themselves. Some say it was a rite of passage, others call it a ritualized genocide. The Helots were not passive. Imagine it. You are born into Helot, and yet you persist, because you must. No monuments commemorate the Helot. No triumphal poems sing of their endurance. And yet, without them, there is no Sparta. Even the famed simplicity of Spartan life, the black broth, the communal barracks, the rejection of luxury, only worked because someone else was growing the food. So when you hear the stories of valiant warriors, remember the invisible hands that made their world possible. And now, as twilight falls across the quiet valleys of Laconia, let us walk softly away from their fields, not as tourists of history, but as mourners, and let your eyes grow heavy, under the weight of all that was never told. Austerity on display. Picture this. A long, narrow stone room. The torches flicker along the rough-hewn walls, casting long shadows. Dozens of men sit shoulder to shoulder on hard wooden benches, heads bowed slightly over clay bowls, filled with a thick, dark liquid. The smell, unsettling. A mix of blood, vinegar, and old animal fat. Welcome to a Spartan dining mess, where hunger was encouraged, and pleasure was suspicious. These were no lavish banquets, no honeyed figs, no fine wines, no exotic meats like those enjoyed in Athens or Corinth. Meals were taken together in Syestia, military-style mess halls, where Spartan men gathered nightly. Attendance was not optional. Even kings sat beside their comrades. This was a place of control, of equality in suffering. You brought your own contributions: barley, cheese, figs, and wine. Failed to do so, you'd be expelled, dishonored, and potentially lose your citizenship. And the Helots prepared the meals in the mess halls, cleaned the bowls, slaughtered the pigs. Their hands ensured Spartan discipline remained uninterrupted. A life where every meal is a reminder that pleasure is dangerous, softness is weakness, and food is fuel. Nothing more. Where even the act of eating reinforces your role in a militarized machine. The Spartan elite dined, not to indulge, but to reinforce their identity as warriors first, humans second, not with gold nor comfort, but with sacrifice, conformity, and silence. Let the sound of scraping wooden spoons be your lullaby, and drift, slowly, into the dark calm of a world where discipline ruled every bite. The conversation was regulated, jokes were sparse and dry. You did not boast, you did not complain. You ate quickly, spoke little, and left silently. This was a test of endurance. Even at the dinner table, pig's blood, vinegar, and salt boiled together with scraps of meat until it became a sour, iron-rich sludge. One famously said that he finally understood how Spartans could face death so fearlessly, because anything was better than another spoonful of that soup. The vinegar kept the blood from clotting. The salt masked the metallic taste. It was austerity in a bowl, and it was mandatory. At the heart of the meal, zomos, or black broth. The ingredients, simple and dreadful. Foreign visitors who tried it were often revolted. Children were deliberately underfed, forced to steal to survive, not to encourage theft, but to teach cunning and self-reliance. But this wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual. No wives were present, no children, just men, hardened, trained, and ever watchful. What about indulgence? That was for the weak. In Sparta, even overeating was considered a moral failing. There were no rich sources, no second servings, no private feasts. Equality through deprivation was the ideal, at least for the full citizens. Women and helots, of course, were another matter. Spartan women cooked at home, their own fare, more varied and generous. Can you imagine this? And yet, in that dim hall, night after night, with the smell of vinegar and blood in the air, Sparta shaped its men. Let the flicker of torchlight fade now. Let the taste of iron vanish from your tongue. Hair shaved, clothes stolen, and a night of silence. Imagine you're a young Spartan woman, strong, tall, and trained to wrestle, to run, to speak your mind. You've been raised to be the mother of warriors, nothing less. There are no slow walks along riverbanks, no banquets held in your honor. You are not a decoration, not a delicate flower. You are expected to be firm, proud, and worthy of the city's most hardened men. And yet, when the time comes to marry, there's no gentle courtship, no love letters exchanged over tea. You would be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, not your own clothes. The transformation was physical, visual, and symbolic. Instead, one day, you are seized, literally kidnapped, by your future husband. This routine night visits in secret might go on for months, or even years, before the man was allowed to formally live with his wife. Privacy was not encouraged. Marriage itself was a state-mandated necessity, not a personal journey, removing individuality to become a vessel of the state. A mother, not a woman. A citizen, not a soul. It sounds like a grim joke, or a myth twisted in translation, but it was a formalized part of the marriage ritual in Sparta. Spartan women were among the most independent in Greece, owning land, speaking in public, commanding respect. Perhaps their strength helped love take root in unexpected places. Then he would leave, not to stay and chat, not to bring flowers or breakfast, just gone. The man would abduct the woman, with the help of friends or family, and take her away to a secret location. Let the faint echo of ancient footsteps fade into nothing. You are no longer waiting in the dark. You are safe, drifting, far from those strange rites and whispered visits. There's something symbolic and utterly strange would happen. Wedding. Your hair would be shaved close to the scalp, removing the long braids you had worn since childhood. And then you would lie down in silence, in a dark room. The groom, also young and nervous, perhaps still a member of the society, still subject to military discipline, would come to you in the dead of night, steal into the room, and consummate the marriage quietly. He would return to the communal barracks, where he still had to sleep and eat with the other men. The goal was clear: procreation of strong Spartan citizens, nothing more. Emotion was irrelevant. Romance, a distraction. These unions were designed for breeding, not bonding. And even the ceremony that sealed it, abduction, shaving, and symbolic dressing, was meant to reinforce the Spartan worldview. Identity was secondary to function. The shaved head was not about humility, it was about erasure. And yet, within this strange silence, some found connection. Some grew to love each other, perhaps in quiet rebellion. Still, it's hard to imagine that first night, the cold, the strangeness, the quiet shuffle of sandals in the dark, as anything but unsettling. So rest now, in the cold hush of Sparta's shadows. No dowels, no dowries, just discus throws, chorus songs, and the weight of the state's expectations. If you were born a girl in Sparta, your fate was decided before your first cry had even faded from the birthing chamber. Just like Spartan boys, you too were inspected at birth. A frail child, regardless of gender, could be abandoned. Strength was the only currency that mattered. You were not meant to be dainty or decorative. Your body, from infancy, belonged to Sparta. As you grew, your childhood looked nothing like that of girls in Athens. There were no loom lessons, no quiet embroidery circles, no elaborate preparations for marriage. They debated with their husbands without fear of reprisal. In fact, Spartan girls were taught to sing in choruses that ridiculed the weak and celebrated the powerful. You were educated by experience, by rigorous physical training, by social expectation, and by relentless exposure to state ideology. You were constantly reminded, your womb belongs to Sparta. Your wealth wasn't yours, it was a resource for Sparta. Your body wasn't yours, it was a tool for producing soldiers. You were expected to raise boys who would not flinch in the face of death, and to send them off with the words, "Come back with your shield or on it." Your greatest honor would be to produce strong sons who died gloriously in battle. Their voices rang out not in timid lullabies but in competitive choral performances, judged for volume, strength, and wit. Let your voice quiet after a lifetime of being loud for the sake of strength. You've done enough. You've earned sleep. Those who survived were trained not only for childbirth but for public fitness and moral fortitude. And the fields lay golden and dry beyond your estate. You might have wondered, what is left of me? More than a matron of bones and labor. You were expected to scorn luxury, reject gossip, and live an austere life, like your male counterparts, though perhaps without the whip scars. But in Sparta, that self was never meant to be center stage. You were strong, not for your sake, but for theirs. But unlike many Greek city-states, where girls married as young as 12 or 13, Sparta waited longer. The reasoning: a physically mature woman would produce healthier children. It was yet another instance of biology serving the state. Instead, you trained, you ran, you threw javelins and discs, you wrestled and raced in public competitions. If your husband remained in the army and, most did, he ran the household, you managed land, slaves, finances. In Sparta, women could own property, and they did. By some estimates, women controlled nearly 2/5 of Spartan landholdings at certain points in history. Your limbs were expected to be strong, your back straight, your mind sharp. You were encouraged, required to speak boldly. Spartan women were known throughout Greece for their outspoken confidence. They issued cutting remarks to foreign diplomats. They rebuked cowardly sons. There was no formal school for girls, but that did not mean there was no education. Marriage came young, typically around age 18, when your body was fully grown. After marriage, your responsibilities were enormous. But don't mistake this for freedom. Motherhood was your battlefield, and grief was weakness. Even daughters had to be strong. Female infants who didn't meet the physical ideal could be exposed, just like the boys. And still, in the quiet hours, when your chores were done, am I more than a vessel? Perhaps in your stolen moments, singing with friends, watching your children sleep, you caught glimpses of a softer self. Now, rest. Let the ache in your shoulders from years of throwing spears fade. Blood for the goddess, strength for the city where endurance was both spectacle and sacrifice. Every year, under the hot Spartan sun, the temple of Artemis Orthia became a theater of pain. Not metaphorical pain, not emotional hardship, real, visceral suffering, carried out in full view of the public. If you were a boy in the later years of the Agoge, your name might be called, and then your skin would meet the lash. This was no symbolic ritual. It was called the diamastagosis, rite in which adolescent boys were whipped until they bled before the altar of the goddess, sometimes until they fainted, sometimes until they died. The altar had once been so crowded with blood and offerings that conflicts broke out during the ritual. To resolve this chaos, the Spartans introduced the lash. It was, to them, an elegant solution. No more chaotic sacrifices, just blood from the boys themselves. It wasn't punishment. It was proof that you could suffer without flinching, that you could control your pain, your fear, your instincts, that you could be a Spartan man, perhaps your backward scar in the shape of victory, a hero not for fighting in battle, but for standing still and bleeding well. The goddess Artemis Orthia was said to demand this offering. Let the echoes of the flute and the cries of the crowd fade into the distance. You've withstood the whip, for tonight at least. Crowds would gather to watch. Parents, elders, even tourists from other Greek cities came to see the show. Boys competed who could take the most lashes, who would pass out first, who would die. That would be weakness. They stood upright, clenching their jaws, refusing to cry out. Their hands sometimes trembled, but those who fell were carried away in disgrace or were. As the event grew over the centuries, it became public spectacle. Sometimes, they were whipped to the rhythm of flutes. The music made the violence feel almost ceremonial. The boys were not tied down. And here rests the detail that might unsettle your dreams tonight. The ones holding the whips were often priests in disguise, or sometimes older boys, now mentors, now torturers. It was a tool of the state, like every other aspect of your life in Sparta. The line between sacred and savage blurred under the beating sun. The blood, the sweat, the dust, it was all part of the training. The whip was not just an object of pain, and when it was over, those who endured were praised, celebrated. Perhaps your name would be inscribed, and if you died, they called you a martyr of discipline. Nabri, let your body sink into stillness. When silence was a strategy, and one-liners were acts of war. If you were a Spartan statesman, or, more accurately, A Spartan soldier handed a diplomatic mission you didn't go into negotiations with lengthy speeches or flowery rhetoric. You went in with a sharp jawline and a sharper tongue, and ideally said as little as possible. Unlike the Athenians, whose orators delivered honeyed speeches and sophisticated arguments in the assembly, Spartans saw words as suspicious. Why talk when you could act? Why explain when you could just say no? This tendency gave rise to what we now call laconic speech after Laconia, the region where Sparta sat. Think of it like ancient dry sarcasm mixed with war-hardened bluntness. No embellishment, no apology, and often no diplomacy at all. Take for example the Persian king Xerxes, who offered the Spartans a deal during his invasion of Greece. If they surrendered, he said, their people would be safe. The Spartans responded with 2 words, molan labe, come and take them. Later, when Philip of Macedon warned Sparta that if he entered their territory, he would destroy them utterly, the Spartans sent back a single-word reply. A man who talked too much was seen as either insecure or deceitful. Boys in the gorge were trained to speak briefly, always with precision and, often, with biting wit. Their famed Peloponnesian League was less about mutual respect than it was about Sparta being in charge. Allies followed, not because they were charmed but because they feared. If you made a clever jab with only a handful of syllables, you might even earn applause. As the world changed, and states like Athens and later Macedon learned to blend soft power with hard muscle, Sparta clung to its ancient silences. When diplomacy required agility, Sparta replied with stone-faced stillness. And history has always kept moving without them. This was not just bravado, it was policy. Let your breathing grow soft, your mind drift gently. The sound of haughty one-word replies has faded. What remains is stillness, Spartan, silent and serene. At diplomatic gatherings, Spartans might be late or entirely silent. In negotiations, they'd either offer a short ultimatum or just walk out. Spartans believe that restraint in speech was strength. This didn't always win them friends. Other Greek city-states found Sparta's behavior rude, cold, or laughably arrogant. The Corinthians were known for long speeches. After being subjected to an elaborate, hour-long argument, the Spartans simply said, "There's a story of a Spartan envoy sent to Corinth. We have forgotten the first half of your speech, and we disagree with the second." When Sparta did form alliances, it was often on the basis of military dominance. This diplomatic, the warrior state that couldn't adapt, even as the world changed around it. As you lie back, eyes closed or soft with stillness, imagine Sparta not the one from movies, but the real city, quiet, plain, and increasingly hollow. After centuries of discipline and domination, Sparta began to collapse not with flames, but with rot from within. Its downfall wasn't sudden. There were no invading hordes battering down golden gates. There was simply ... decline. The kind that happens slowly, like erosion, barely visible, until one day the foundations are gone. Cities rebelled, borders buckled. Even within Sparta, problems festered. Most notably, Spartans were disappearing. Some citizens were so poor they could no longer afford to contribute to the communal messes their shared meals required to retain citizenship, and so they were cast out of political life entirely. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta suffered a shocking defeat. Still proud, but by then, Sparta was a shadowy place tourists visited to see the ruins of discipline, not its practice. It was a world of empires now, not cities. From the clatter of bronze armor to the rustle of weeds growing over old stones, Sparta fell not with a scream but with a slow, proud silence. And in that new age, Sparta became little more than a lesson in what happens when you cannot change. Still steeped in ritual, but no longer feared. Not only was their myth of invincibility shattered, but their core military modeled a hoplite phalanx was now outdated. The first cracks appeared after the Peloponnesian War. Yes, Sparta had won against Athens, but it wasn't a clean victory. Years of brutal warfare, shifting alliances, and devastating plague had drained the Greek world. And Sparta was militaristic. Never etch had stretched itself thin. The one certain grip it held over its allies began to slip. See, full Spartan citizenship, the kind that allowed you to vote, own land, and fight in the phalanx, was extremely rare. Over time, as war took its toll and fewer boys survived the scourge, Sparta found itself with not enough Spartans. They were outnumbered by Helots, surrounded by enemies, and clinging to a system that didn't evolve. Land began concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. The gap between rich and poor Spartans widened. Meanwhile, foreign powers were learning new tactics. Thebes, once a secondary power, reorganized its army and challenged Spartan supremacy directly. In time, Sparta became a curiosity. The Romans admired Spartan discipline, even copying parts of their system in legend and lore. Even in decline, Spartans clung to their traditions. But the world no longer operated on silence, obedience, and simplicity. Now, gently breathe. Let your thoughts drift across the centuries. Up next is our final segment. A tale of two Greek cities, told through texture, taste, and philosophy. As you settle deeper into rest, we turn our gaze across the mountains, across dusty valleys and silver-leaved groves, to the other great pole of ancient Greece. If Sparta was forged from iron, Athens was pressed from olive oil, fragrant, smooth, luminous. The two cities stood for very different things. One for discipline and endurance, the other for thought and art. And in their eyes, the other was often perplexing. Where Athenians adorned their homes with painted pottery, read poetry under the stars, to Spartans, it was survival food, functional, not frilly, and debated politics in the agora. Spartans ate in silence, trained in mud, and drank their infamous black broth. To Athenian Sparta was bizarre. Where Athenians prized wit, debate, and clever speech, Spartans taught boys to speak little and hit hard. Athenians mocked this. They joked that it could kill appetite, that it was a punishment disguised as a meal. In Athens, the streets echoed with discussion, Socrates questioning youth, playwrights mocking politicians, sculptors chiseling the human form into marble perfection. Spartans, though they rarely said it aloud, envied Athenian beauty in art, in ideas, in the ease with which they seemed to live. Victory for Sparta came at a price. They had beaten the artists, but not the idea of Athens. That idea, democracy, dialogue, drama, would live longer than any Spartan law or spear. Their architecture was airy and ambitious, reflecting ideals of balance, thought, and proportion. In Sparta, buildings were simple, utilitarian, and left no legacy of grandeur. Their beauty was not in stone, but in discipline, in the rhythm of feet marching in lockstep, the stillness of boys enduring cold. Philosophically, they were oceans apart. Athens believed in openness. It built an empire through alliances, trade, and culture. It celebrated the individual. Sparta believed in control. It built walls not of stone, but of soldiers, and valued the collective over the self. And yet, there was respect, begrudging perhaps, but real. Athenians admired Spartan bravery, their stubborn independence, the tension between them culminated in the Peloponnesian War, a long, bitter struggle that left both cities diminished. And so, as your breathing softens, imagine the contrast. One city of marble, olive trees, scrolls, and wine. The other of iron, sweat, shields, and scars. Each thought, the other strange, but together, they carved the soul of Greece. Let that duality guide you into sleep, the world of silence and speech, duty and desire, iron and oil.